August 1982, Polk County, Tennessee. The air was not air. It was a wet woolen blanket soaked in the heat of a kiln. It settled in the hollows. It clung to the ridges. It pressed down on the tin roofs of the farmhouses scattered along the Ocoee River basin, a heavy, invisible hand. The cicadas buzzed in a single, unceasing wave of sound, a high electric drone that was the very noise of summer's peak. The dust from the gravel roads was the color of rust, fine as flour, and it coated everything. It coated the leaves of the kudzu that swallowed the gullies. It coated the windows of the Ford pickups and the John Deere tractors. It coated the tongues of the men who stood in the shade of the Ducktown Co-op, talking in low tones about the price of beef, the lack of rain, the cost of money. This was a summer of worry, a summer of tight belts and tighter lips. The interest rates, set by men in cities far away, had climbed like a fever, reaching heights no one had ever seen. 18%, 19%. Farmers who had borrowed money when it was cheap now found themselves drowning in debt that swelled and swelled, a monstrous thing that ate their equity, ate their sleep, ate their future. The land, which had been in families for 100 years, for 150 years, was suddenly not a certainty. It was collateral. It was a number on a ledger in the county seat of Benton. It was a thing that could be lost. And it was being lost. Auction notices were tacked to the bulletin board at the post office, crisp white squares of paper announcing the end of a family's world. It was in this summer, on a Tuesday hot enough to melt the asphalt on the state highway, that Elspeth May Collins received her notice. She was 58 years old, a widow for 6 years. Her husband, John, had been taken by his heart, a sudden, silent event that had left a void in the house and in the fields. Elspeth was a woman carved from the Appalachian hills themselves. Tall, spare, with hands that were a roadmap of hard work. Her hair, once the color of corn silk, was now a pale silvery gray, pulled back in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were the color of a cloudy sky, and they missed nothing. She lived on the 80 acres John had inherited from his father, a piece of land that rose from the banks of Buckner's Creek up a steep, wooded ridge. It was not easy land. It was rocky. The soil was thin and acidic, a legacy of the copper smelting that had denuded the surrounding landscape for a century. The old-timers said you could not farm the land in the Copper Basin. You could only fight it to a draw. The notice came in a long white envelope, delivered by the rural mail carrier in his dusty Chevrolet. It had the return address of the Ocoee Valley Bank. Elspeth knew what it was before she opened it. She had been expecting it for months, the way one expects a coming storm. She slit the envelope open with a paring knife, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The paper inside was thick, official. It spoke in a language of clauses and subsections, of default and acceleration, of foreclosure and public auction. The numbers were stark. A principal of $11,217.34, an accrued interest that made her breath catch in her throat. The date of the auction was set for September the 15th. She had 3 weeks. She stood on her porch, the letter in her hand, and looked out over her land. The small herd of Hereford cattle, 20 head in all, grazed listlessly in the heat-scorched pasture. The vegetable garden, her primary source of food and a small income from the farmer's market, was wilting despite her morning and evening waterings from the well. The house, built by John's grandfather from timber cut on the property, needed paint. The barn roof needed patching. Everything needed something. Everything needed money she did not have. The community had a word for her situation: grief. They said the grief had taken her husband, and now it was taking her sense. She had let the fields go, they whispered. She had sold off the best of the herd after John died. She had not replanted the bottomland with a cash crop. She was letting the place fall to ruin, a slow, quiet surrender. Her brother-in-law, Marcus Collins, who farmed the 200 acres adjacent to hers, a sprawling, prosperous operation, had said as much to her face. He had offered to help. He had offered to buy her out, to pay the bank what was owed, and give her a small sum to live on. A kindness, he had called it. She had looked at him with those cloudy, unreadable eyes and said no. Just the one word, no. Now, with the foreclosure notice in her hand, the end seemed inevitable. The men at the co-op would nod grimly. The women at the church would offer their prayers and their pity. Marcus would shake his head, his kindness rejected, his prediction proven true. The bank would take the land. It was the way of things in the summer of 1982. But Elspeth May Collins did not surrender. She did not weep. She did not go to her brother-in-law, hat in hand. She folded the notice from the bank, placed it back in its envelope, and laid it on the kitchen table. Then she went to the pie safe in the corner of the room, a heavy piece of oak that had been her grandmother's. From behind a stack of tablecloths, she retrieved a small metal cash box. Inside was what the community called egg money. Money saved over decades, $1 here, $5 there, from the sale of eggs, of vegetables from her garden, of the quilts she stitched during the long winter months. It was her emergency fund, her final reserve. She counted it out on the oilcloth of the kitchen table. Worn $1 bills, fives, a few tens, a handful of 20s. The total was $492. It was not enough to stop the bank. It was not enough to make a meaningful payment. It was not enough to even delay the inevitable for more than a few weeks, perhaps a month if the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, was feeling charitable. It was a pittance against a mountain of debt. What she did next was the act that cemented her reputation in the county. It was the decision that moved the whispers from pity to outright ridicule. She did not drive to the bank in Benton. She took $450 of that money, leaving herself with just $42. She wrapped the bills in a piece of brown paper and put them in her handbag. She went to the closet and took out a long, cylindrical tube of cardboard, capped at both ends. Inside was a document, rolled tight, that was even older than the pie safe. Then she got in her 10-year-old Plymouth Duster, a car the color of faded denim, and drove the 50 miles of winding mountain roads east to the city of Chattanooga. She was not going to see a lawyer. She was not going to plead with a banker at the regional office. She was going to hire a surveyor. Not just any surveyor. She was going to hire Silas Croft, a man known throughout East Tennessee for two things. He was the most expensive surveyor in the state, and he was the most meticulous. He was a man who trusted old deeds more than new maps. A man who still used a Gunter's chain when the younger men were all using electronic distance measurement. He was a man who charged a premium for his obsessive precision. $450. It was the cost of his retainer. It was the price to get him to drive out to Polk County and begin the work. It was, in the eyes of everyone who heard about it later, the most foolish act of a woman lost in her grief. It was throwing good money after bad. It was burning her last bridge. It was, they said, a final, desperate, nonsensical act of defiance against a world that had already beaten her. They were wrong. The transaction itself was a study in contrasts. Elspeth arrived at Silas Croft's office, a small, cluttered room above a hardware store in downtown Chattanooga, in the late afternoon. The office smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint metallic scent of drafting ink. Maps were stacked in leaning towers on every flat surface. Brass surveying instruments, polished to a dull gleam, sat on wooden tripods in the corners. Silas Croft was a man much like his office, old, cluttered with knowledge, and from a different era. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a face deeply lined from years of squinting into the sun. He wore suspenders over a sweat-stained work shirt. He looked at Elspeth over the top of his spectacles, his expression one of professional skepticism. She did not explain the foreclosure. She did not speak of her desperation. She simply unwrapped the $450 and laid the worn bills on his desk. Then she uncapped the cardboard tube and unrolled the document within. It was the original 1891 land grant deed. The paper was thick as hide, yellowed with age. The text was written in an elegant looping calligraphy. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. It was a deed of metes and bounds, a legal description that relied not on coordinates, but on the landscape itself. It spoke of property lines that ran, thence 120 poles to a great oak now gone, and thence north by east along the mean course of Buckner's Creek, and, most importantly, thence rising from the creek bed to a procession of stone sentinels, and following said sentinels to the ridge line. Silas Croft picked up the deed, his movements gentle, reverent. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently. He looked at the cash on his desk. He looked at the woman sitting before him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. Most people who came to him with old deeds were chasing fantasies, hoping to find a lost gold mine or a forgotten claim that would make them rich. They were dreamers. This woman was not a dreamer. There was a hard, pragmatic certainty in her gaze. She was not asking him to find a treasure. She was asking him to find a line drawn on the earth a century ago. He told her his fee. He told her the 450 was only the beginning. He told her the work would be slow, that it could take weeks. He told her he might find nothing, that the lines on her modern tax map were likely correct. He was, in his own way, warning her not to waste her money. She just nodded. "Find the stone sentinels," she said. It was not a plea, it was an instruction. He took the job. He took her money. He told her he would be out the following Monday to begin. The news of what Elspeth had done traveled back to Polk County before she did. A cousin of the hardware store owner worked at the courthouse in Benton, and the story spread like wildfire through the small-town grapevine. By the time she returned home that evening, the verdict had already been rendered. At the Ducktown Co-op, where farmers gathered to drink Coca-Cola from glass bottles and escape the heat, the judgment was swift and unanimous. Old man Guthrie, who had known Elspeth's husband since they were boys, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He declared it a crying shame. The Plemons brothers, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, laughed out loud. $450 for a surveyor? They said you could buy a decent bull for that price. A bull would make you money. A surveyor would just give you a fancy piece of paper confirming what you already knew, that you were broke. The consensus was that she had finally lost her mind. The grief, they said again, shaking their heads. It had addled her wits. In the parking lot of the First Baptist Church after the Wednesday night prayer meeting, the women's verdict was softer, but no less certain. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and concern. Sister Agnes Miller, the formidable head of the Ladies' Auxiliary, suggested they take up a collection for Elspeth. Not for the bank, of course, that was a lost cause, but for her, so she would have something to live on after she lost the farm. They whispered about her pride, her stubbornness, her refusal to accept help from her own family. They prayed for her soul, and they prayed for her to find peace, a peace they were certain she would only find once the burden of the land was lifted from her shoulders. The most damning judgment came from her own kin. Her brother-in-law, Marcus Collins, drove his new Ford F-150 up her driveway, leaving a plume of angry dust in his wake. He did not get out of the truck. He sat behind the wheel, the engine rumbling, and spoke to her through the open passenger window. His voice was a mixture of frustration and a sort of weary, self-righteous anger. He had heard what she did. He asked if it was true. She confirmed it was. He asked her why. She did not answer. He told her, his voice rising, that he had made her a fair offer, a generous offer. He was offering to save the family name from the embarrassment of an auction. He was offering to keep the land, John's land, in the family. And what had she done? She had taken her last pennies and thrown them away on a fool's errand. A surveyor. To resurvey land that had been surveyed and recorded and taxed for decades. He told her the bank's lawyers would laugh at her. He told her she was making a spectacle of herself. He told her his offer was still on the table, but it would not be for long. He was a businessman, after all. She listened to it all, her face impassive. When he was finished, she simply said, "Thank you for your concern, Marcus." Then she turned and walked back into her house, leaving him sitting in his truck, fuming in the hot afternoon sun. Even the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, a man not known for his sense of humor, was said to have chuckled when he heard the news. He saw it for what everyone else did, a desperate, pointless delay tactic, a final, futile gesture. He told his head teller that it changed nothing. The auction would proceed as scheduled. The law was the law. The numbers were the numbers. A new map would not change the amount of money that was owed. The community's reaction, from the laughter at the co-op to the pity at the church, was not born of malice. It was born of a deep, ingrained pragmatism. It was born of conventional wisdom, a wisdom hardened by generations of lean years and hard-won survival in the unforgiving Appalachian soil. Their reasoning was sound. It was logical. It was, from every available piece of evidence, entirely correct. First, there was the matter of the existing survey. The land had been officially surveyed in 1965, when John Collins had first taken out a small loan from the bank to buy a new tractor. That survey had been conducted by a reputable firm from Cleveland, Tennessee. It had been filed with the county registrar. It was the basis for the property's tax assessment. It was, in the parlance of the law, the official record. In the hills of East Tennessee, where property lines were often a matter of folklore and gentlemen's agreements, from the big rock to the lightning-struck pine, an official, stamped survey was as good as gospel. To challenge it was to challenge the very foundation of modern land ownership. It simply was not done. Second, there was the perceived value of the land itself. The 80 acres owned by Elspeth were considered marginal at best. The soil was poor, a thin layer of topsoil over dense clay and rock. The slopes were too steep for cultivation. The timber was mostly scrub pine, sweet gum, and poplar, not the valuable hardwoods like oak and walnut that grew on other parts of the ridge. Its only real value was for grazing a small number of cattle, and even that was difficult. The best use for the land, Marcus had often said, was to let it grow back to wilderness for hunting. The official tax appraisal valued the entire 80-acre parcel at $12,000. The debt to the bank was over $11,000. There was no hidden value, no untapped potential that a new survey could possibly uncover. Spending $450, nearly 4% of the property's total value, just to redraw the lines, seemed like an act of financial insanity. Third, there was the nature of the debt itself. The farm crisis of the early 1980s was not a crisis of lazy farmers or poor management. It was a crisis of finance. The Volcker-led Federal Reserve had raised interest rates to historic levels to combat inflation, and the ripple effect had crippled the agricultural sector. The loan on the Collins farm, once manageable, had become an impossible burden. This was a problem of dollars and cents, of interest rates and principal payments. It was a mathematical problem. And a surveyor's transit and chain were not the right tools to solve a math problem. The only tool that could solve it was money, and money was the one thing Elspeth did not have.
The community saw a woman acting out of emotion, a widow clinging to the past, to an old piece of paper, because she could not face the hard realities of the present. They saw her hiring of Silas Croft not as a strategy, but as a symptom of grief, a symptom of denial, a symptom of a proud woman's inability to accept defeat.
Every piece of their collective experience, every story they had ever heard, every auction they had ever attended, told them that this story would end in only one way, with the sound of the auctioneer's gavel. On the following Monday, a week after the notice had arrived, Silas Croft's Ford pickup truck, a dusty dark green F-100 with wooden side rails, rumbled up Elspeth's driveway. He did not stop at the house. He drove past it, toward the barn, and parked in the shade of a large water oak. The community watched. From his fields across the creek, Marcus Collins watched from the seat of his tractor, a tiny, judgmental figure in the distance. Neighbors driving by on the county road slowed their cars, craning their necks to get a look at the man who was taking the widow's last dollar. The mail carrier made a point of stopping to chat with Elspeth, his real purpose being to get a closer look at the surveyor and his equipment. Silas Croft ignored them all. He was a man at work. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He unloaded his tools from the truck bed, a heavy wooden tripod, a brass transit in a worn leather case, a steel gunter's chain, each link polished smooth by a century of use, a set of ranging poles, painted in alternating bands of red and white, a brush axe, a plumb bob. These were the tools of an older time, instruments of precision that relied on the skill of the user, not on batteries or electronics. He did not begin by walking the property lines. He began by sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a thermos of coffee and a set of maps. He had the 1965 survey plat, he had the county tax map, and he had Elspeth's 1891 deed. He spent the entire morning just looking at the papers, comparing the new to the old, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a historian as much as a surveyor, a man who understood that every piece of land had a story, and the story was often hidden in the contradictions between the documents.
His first 3 days were spent on the known boundaries. He started where the 1965 survey started, at a concrete monument set by the county road. He calibrated his transit, set his poles, and began the slow, painstaking work of retracing the recorded lines. He worked alone, hacking through briars and thickets, his progress measured in feet and inches. He checked the southern and western boundaries, the lines that bordered Marcus Collins's property and another small farm. He found the iron pins set in 1965, rusted but still in place. So far, the modern survey was holding up. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The community watched this, and their certainty grew. He was just confirming what everyone already knew. The Plemons brothers made a joke at the co-op that Elspeth was paying a man $100 a day to prove the bank was right. The laughter was louder this time. The fourth day, Silas Croft turned his attention to the eastern boundary.
This was the line that was defined on the modern maps and in the 1965 survey by Buckner's Creek. It was a common practice in the region to use a creek as a boundary. It was a clear, visible line. It was easy. It made sense. The survey from 1965 showed the property line running directly down the center of the shallow, rocky creek bed. But the 1891 deed told a different story. It mentioned the creek, but only as a starting point, thence rising from the creek bed to a procession of stone sentinels. Silas spent the entire day walking the eastern bank of the creek. The land rose steeply from the water, a tangled mess of rhododendron, mountain laurel, and poison ivy. It was a wall of green. He was looking for something that had been named almost a century ago, a procession of stone sentinels. He did not know what they were. Were they a line of man-made cairns, a natural rock formation, a series of boundary markers set by the original surveyor? The deed was poetic, but not precise. He found nothing. The day was hot, the insects were relentless, and the terrain was brutal. He returned to his truck at dusk, his clothes torn, his face and arms covered in scratches. He looked tired and frustrated. Marcus Collins saw him leave and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The fantasy was colliding with the hard reality of the land. For another week, Silas Croft searched. He abandoned the creek bank and began a series of grid searches, moving slowly up the steep hillside. He used his brush axe to cut narrow paths through the undergrowth, sight lines just wide enough for a man to pass. He fought through spider webs that were thick as thread. He disturbed a copperhead snake, which gave the ridge its local name, and had to scramble backward down the slope, his heart pounding. He was beginning to think the men at the co-op were right. He was on a fool's errand. The stone sentinels were likely a flight of fancy from the original surveyor, or a feature that had been destroyed by time, by logging, by the slow, inexorable power of the forest to reclaim its own. He took a day off from the field and drove to the county courthouse in Benton. He spent hours in the basement archives, a dim, musty room where the old county records were kept. He pulled the original surveyor's logbook from 1891. He found the entry for the Collins property grant. The handwriting was faint, the pages brittle. He read the field notes. They were filled with the mundane details of the work: weather observations, compass readings, chain measurements. And then he found it. A small, hand-drawn sketch in the margin of the page. It was a crude drawing of the eastern boundary. It showed the creek. And then, east of the creek, it showed a series of small circles, labeled granite outcrops. Beneath the sketch, the surveyor had written a note. The stone sentinels stand like men on the hillside, a most remarkable and permanent boundary. Granite outcrops, not cairns, not markers, a natural feature. And they were, according to the original surveyor, permanent. Armed with this new information, Silas Croft returned to the ridge. He was no longer looking for something small, for a man-made sign. He was looking for the bones of the mountain itself. He moved further east, away from the creek, higher up the slope, into the dense, old-growth timber that had never been clear-cut. And on the 11th day of his search, in the late afternoon, he found the first one. It was almost completely buried in a century of leaf litter and topsoil. Only a small, moss-covered curve of gray rock was visible. It looked like any other rock, but something about its shape, its placement, made him stop. He took out a small trowel and began to dig. He dug for 20 minutes, the sweat pouring down his face, and slowly he uncovered it. It was a massive granite boulder, a glacial erratic, shaped like a giant, worn tooth. It rose nearly 7 feet from the ground. It was not native to the immediate geology. It was a sentinel. His heart quickened. He took a compass reading. Then, using the old surveyor's notes, he projected a line, north by northeast. He paced off the distance mentioned in the logbook. He began to search again, his eyes now trained to look for a specific shape, a specific type of stone. 30 minutes later, he found the second one, and then the third. They were exactly where the 1891 deed said they would be. A procession of them, 5 in all, marching in a nearly straight line up the face of Copperhead Ridge. They had been hidden in plain sight for 91 years. The surveyor in 1965, likely working on a hot day, in a hurry, had taken the easy boundary. He had followed the creek. He had never bothered to fight his way up the ridge. He had never bothered to look for the stones.
He had drawn a line on a map that was convenient, but wrong. Silas Croft knew in that moment that he had found it. He had found the true boundary, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the oppressive heat, that everything was about to change. The next week was a blur of methodical, obsessive work. Now that he had his anchor points, the 5 stone sentinels, he had to map the line precisely. He cleared the sight lines between the granite outcrops. He set up his transit, leveled it, and took his readings. He measured the distances with his steel chain, a 2-man job that he performed alone, painstakingly, driving a stake, pulling the chain taut, marking the spot, and repeating the process again and again. He worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by coffee and a profound sense of professional vindication. He was no longer just a surveyor for hire.
He was an agent of history, correcting a mistake that had been set in paper and stone for decades. He was uncovering a truth that the land itself had held secret. The final piece of the puzzle was the ridgeline. The 1891 deed stated that the boundary followed the stone sentinels to the ridgeline. Silas followed his new line to the very top of Copperhead Ridge. The view from the summit was breathtaking. To the west lay the Collins farm, a small patch of green in the vast forested landscape. To the east, the land fell away toward the holdings of the Tennessee Copper Company, a landscape still scarred from a century of mining and smelting. And then he chained the final boundary, the northern line, from the ridge back down to the county road. When he was finished, when he had connected all the dots and closed the survey loop, he sat on a log and did the calculations in his notebook. The numbers did not make sense at first. He checked them again, and then a third time. They were correct. The property described in the 1891 deed, the property legally owned by Elspeth May Collins, was not 80 acres. It was 127 acres. The 47 acres of discrepancy were not just any land. They were not more scrub brush and rocky pasture. They were the entire southern face of Copperhead Ridge, from the creek all the way to the summit. A steep, heavily wooded piece of land that happened to be the exact parcel the Tennessee Valley Authority had been trying to acquire for the better part of a decade. The TVA needed the land for a new high-voltage transmission line and a planned electrical substation to power the growing industrial corridor in the next county. They had approached the Copper Company, who they believed owned the land, with offers multiple times. The Copper Company, whose own records were a mess of century-old deeds, had always refused to sell, believing the land was a buffer to their own operations. Everyone was wrong. The bank was wrong. The county tax assessor was wrong. The Tennessee Copper Company was wrong. The TVA was wrong. The land did not belong to the Copper Company. It belonged to the widow. On the third Monday, precisely 3 weeks after Elspeth Collins had first walked into his office, Silas Croft drove his pickup truck not to her farm, but to the town of Benton. He parked in front of the Ocoee Valley Bank. He was not wearing his field clothes. He wore a starched white shirt, a string tie, and a clean pair of trousers. He carried a single, large, freshly drafted plat map. He walked into the bank and asked to see Mr. Abernathy. The bank manager agreed to see him, assuming the surveyor was there to report his failure, to confirm the bank's position before the auction. He greeted Silas with a smug, knowing little smile. He gestured for him to sit down. Silas Croft did not sit. He walked to Mr. Abernathy's large mahogany desk and unrolled the plat map. He weighted the corners with a paperweight and a stapler. The map was a work of art, a masterpiece of cartographic precision. Every line was drawn in crisp black ink,